up with when she went to...
Yeah, so this girl went to the palace of the Count Tushkevich, and one day she simply did not come back. And at that time, the law permitted to Christian people to practically kidnap a Jewish child if they would adopt the child and Christian it. There was nothing the parents, the natural parents of that child, could do to prevent it.
Hold on a second. Keep my meter? Yeah. How much time is there? 30 just this? Okay. What? You know, keep that buzzer off.
Yeah.
It is. Hold on a second. Okay.
It sounds nice. It sounds like a Hanukkah dreidel. Huh? Yeah.
This is quarter business.
Okay, so I was at the palace of the...
Wait, do we have speed?
Yeah, speak.
Oh yeah, so as I was saying, there was this law that permitted these things to happen, and there was nothing that the parents could do. My great-grandfather was affected. It was like losing a child. He said shiver for 1 week. For him, that girl was dead. And the thing was finished. This little girl disappeared completely from the life of the family, of the... It so happened that years later, when I have met this aunt, the aunt of my mother, as a grown-up person, she told me that throughout the years, when she was adopted by the Polish couple, when she was sent to the college of young girls of the Polish aristocracy in the center of Vilna at the Benedictine monastery and so on, she was always in secret looking up what was happening to her brother, other members of the family. She never forgot the family she came from. I suppose she must have maybe felt guilty that she has chosen this very comfortable life and so on. I don't know. I don't know if she loved those people. I have no idea. But anyway, this little girl, I would say, if destiny arranges thing for a man like myself to be a survivor and so on, so destiny has arranged for the kidnapping of this girl, because as a grown-up woman, this aunt was absolutely indispensable for our survival. I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here today if that girl would not have been kidnapped and became a Christian according to those anti-Semitic laws. So this is the story to which I will maybe come back later of my of this aunt. Now, my grandfather, he grew up in a very loving family, which was a very peculiar family, because this was this mechanic who was a blind man. And there I must maybe go back a few years before to explain how a blind man can be a mechanic, because he was not really blind to begin with. He was I think, a very humble man, having a little shop in which he was doing his business. His wife had a small shop of vegetables and fruits and so on. And that was already when they had 2 or 3 children. No, they had 2 children. There was the uncle who years later became a very famous Jewish musician and writer and philosopher with the name of Arno Nadel. Maybe we should leave this.
Yes, we'll change focal length.
Pass by. Okay. So when my grandmother was a baby, her father got an infection in one of his eyes. It must have been a little metallic particle that went into his eye, and it became very badly infected, and he was on the point of losing the sight of that eye, and the doctors told my grandmother to take her husband and to go to Königsberg. Königsberg was in Prussia, this big city where he could be helped. In Vilna there was no way to deal with. So she has sold everything she had. She left the baby, my grandmother, with a nurse, and she went with the boy and her husband to Königsberg. And when they arrived to Königsberg, in order to save the life of this man, they had to take out his eye, while the second eye was infected. And they told her, now whatever you have, take all your money and go to Berlin, because there is only one specialist in Berlin that can save the life of your husband. So this poor woman with a sick husband and with a boy went to Berlin, where actually the specialist saved the life of her husband but did not save his sight. So she found herself in this very hostile city, because also the Jews of Berlin, the real German Jews, they looked upon the Jews that were arriving from Russia as if they were the pest, the Ostjuden. So this poor woman, without a penny, with a blind husband and this little boy, thought that she will go to the chief rabbi and ask him for help. And the chief rabbi of Berlin was so moved by the story of this woman that he told her, look, here is money, go to Vilna, try to somehow find an occupation for yourself, take up your shop and so on, and leave me the boy, I will take care of the boy. That's what she did. The boy remained with the rabbi, and he had a fantastic education. He never wanted to go back to Vilna. Even when it became possible to go back to Vilna, he went to the Theological Institute. He made all the studies to become a rabbi. He has finished his studies as a musician in the conservatory. He went to the art school and he was an artist, and he has made a PhD, I think 2 PhDs in philosophy, and he was really a very exceptional man. But he always kept a certain relationship with this baby sister of his, who then became, of course, a young woman, and who married the boy who worked in the shop of the blind man. Now, just to go back to the blind man. I know that this blind man, he liked very much to sing. He liked very much to sing, and this is maybe where he passed on the musical talent to his son. But I guess that after about half a year or a year of just sitting around in this total darkness and singing, he was bored to death, and he asked his wife to let him get some tools with which he could work. Should I stop?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, no, yeah.
Oh, it's all right. It's all right. I mean, telling stories is a living thing. I mean, interruptions and so on. So, as I was saying, this blind man in the beginning was sitting at home and simply singing to himself, and then he got fed up with the singing, and he decided to do something, and he tried to work some very elementary things that he can do based on his memory and the memory in his fingers. And within a couple of months, he was capable practically to come back to his work. And he was working, and he had assistants. And then he discovered some talents which were exceptional, which combined his hearing to the work that he was doing, which were mechanics. So little by little, the banks in the town discovered that whenever they had a problem with the safe, where the key got stuck or they couldn't open it and so on, there was this man who was capable of dealing with it. So actually, as a mechanic, becoming blind has improved very much his situation. Now, my grandfather was, as a boy, one of the assistants there. He married then, years later, the girl of his boss, and he took over the shop. My grandfather took over the shop, which for him was a place where all sorts of things could be created, not always for practical purposes. He was I would say that my grandfather was a real poet of the mechanical world. He loved to invent machines and so on. He was as a grandfather, the grandfather that one really loves to have. A grandfather that is surrounded by canaries, by singing birds. He had, when he was eating, he was always knocking on his plate, and a bird would come and sit in the house. I think somebody wanted to come in, and so maybe yeah, okay. So this was my mother's father, this grandfather who inherited the shop of his blind father-in-law. His wife was born with a genius for affairs. She took over a small shop of fruit and vegetable, and within, I think, 5 years, she has created a company with about 10 men who owned other shops, and they started to import and export fruit and vegetables and so on. And she must have been a very powerful personality, and I don't think that I would have liked to deal with her, professionally, because I remember that the people were so afraid of her, all her associates. She was like a Golda Meir. I remember that when she was coming with me, I was a tiny child. She was coming with me into the shop. Talking would stop. The man, she was a tiny and rather round woman, but nobody dared to talk without asking permission, and so on. So this grandmother was. She was in her field like a queen, and maybe a little despotic queen. And she has permitted her husband, who was my grandfather, to make a complete departure into poetry with his mechanics. He dedicated his time to the invention of machines. He invented machines. He even had once a silver medal in an international machine exhibition somewhere in Germany. He invented something very important, but he never thought, of course, of registering this thing. And the Singer industry stole his invention and started to produce it on a very large scale, making a lot of money. But since they felt a little guilty, they gave my grandfather the right to be an agent for Singer's sewing machines in Vilna. Now, this was the last thing that interested him. Whenever somebody was coming into the shop and asking about a Singer machine, he would convince the people that they don't need it, that they were going to spend a lot of money and they can do the same thing with their hands or so on. So in later years, when my mother's sister, Yetta, started to work with her father, then the business started really to work well, because every time a client was coming in, Yetta needed badly a cigarette or something and told her father, please, Daddy, do me a favor, go out and do this or that, and so on. So this was my grandfather. But he was a fantastic grandfather. We used to walk a lot in town. In wintertime, he was always taking me on the sledge, which with the little bells ringing, and those horses that were bringing us around in town and so on. I was really very lucky. I was the first grandchild on both sides, and they called me the Jesusl. It means the small Jesus, because I must have been such a spoiled brat, it's impossible today when I think about it. The memory of my grandparents' apartments were in my mother's parents' apartment. All the furniture was tied up with ropes. Everything was tied up with ropes in order to save the things, because I would take out things and so on. In my father's parents' house, there was no limit. I could do everything. For instance, I loved to be on a boat in the living room. Now, to create a boat in the living room, it meant to dismantle completely the sofa, and it meant to pour buckets of water on the parquet, which was absolutely permitted. There was I with a bucket of water and my grandmother, and we were pouring water on the parquet, and there was a maid standing there to to take up the water after that. But this was done because the child had to have pleasure. You know? So I was very, very, very lucky. I was very lucky.
Which grandfather had the aquarium?
Oh, the aquarium, the famous aquarium, was of course the grandfather of the canaries and of the fish and of the animals. In this house there were about, I think, 2-3 cats. It's like a paradise, because I mean sometimes one of the cats ate one of the birds, but nobody is perfect. But there were dogs. There were about 2-3 dogs. There were those singing birds. My grandfather was a member of a club of owners of singing birds that had meetings and so on. And then there were the fantastic aquarium of fish. This aquarium was it had an octagonal shape. It must have been a hideous piece of work. It was in bronze. It had, I think, about 8 terrible claws of an animal as legs. It stood in the middle of the living room. It had some water that was sprinkling. It had artificial rocks inside. It must have weighted, I don't know, I guess at least 5,000 pounds or so. I don't know. It was not one of those regular aquariums. And he had fabulous fish. He had those. I don't know how they brought such fish to Vilna, because those were fish from the Red Sea. I remember as a child, I was always looking at the cat that was sitting on the edge of the aquarium, looking at the fish, and I was very much hoping that the cat will fall into the water, and the cat was doing like this sometimes, but the fish were there. And well, I must say that, when the war started, it was for me one of the happiest moments of my life. First of all, because life became very interesting. It brought the aquarium to my parents' apartment, and all the fish arrived for a very short moment to our apartment. But there were also lots of people who came then to Vilna from Warsaw. There were refugees. In our house, every day was filled with some newcomers, and everyone was full of stories. And my father was then busy in introducing and hiding diamonds into the false teeth of the people who in that time were going from Warsaw through Vilna to Shanghai and to America. And this was the only way to go through the border and all the control with anything of value. It was to hide diamonds. Now, usually those people who hid their money or their gold into their shoes and so on were losing everything, because the Russians on the border learned it very quickly that the best thing is just to undress those people and take everything away from them. The only way was to have it in their body. And one of the places was the mouth. So I remember that there were tens and tens of these people waiting in our place while their false teeth were being redone with spaces for the hiding of diamonds. This was very amusing. This was very funny. Then something else which was extraordinary. My mother's grandparents were kicked out from their beautiful apartment because the Russian general was put into that apartment. This is when the aquarium came to our place. And where did they go to live? With my other grandparents. So all of a sudden, I had 2 grandmothers and 2 grandfathers living in the same place, and they were very close. They became then very close friends. They became very close friends. These were fantastic things for a child. Well, of course, later, what has happened is that both my grandfathers were arrested and shot at the same moment. And both my grandmothers later in the ghetto, there was a second ghetto in Vilna, which was liquidated, I think, on a Yom Kippur. Both my grandmothers died also, holding hands. Well, of course, I did not know that all this was leading to that. All I knew then is that I had the time of my life, because with all these things happening, the aquarium and this fantastic fish arrived home. It was an unbelievable thing to transport such an aquarium. Well, they took it apart and they put it together, and then our maid said, "But my goodness, it's so dirty, I have to wash it well." So the fish were waiting in buckets, and the maid came with some green soap, and she washed very, very well the aquarium, and they put in the water into the aquarium, and they put in the fish into the aquarium. This was already late in the day, and next morning, all the fish were floating. They were all poisoned by the soap. They were floating on the surface of the aquarium. So the maid came with a bucket, and she put in all the fish, and I think that part of those beautiful fish were given to our cat Murka. We had a cat, was called Murka. It was the only person beside myself to whom our maid was speaking, on speaking terms, because she was not talking to my mother. She was always angry at the whole world, and she wouldn't talk to my mother, and they were communicating with a piece of paper. She's a very proud Russian woman, our Ksenia. And a few days later, I remember it must have been Yom Kippur. It was because on Yom Kippur, my grandfather would come straight from the synagogue to have lunch with my parents, because he felt that he could not fast. He could not go on fasting if he did not have a light lunch or so on. So he would come home and so on. And in the dining room, there was this aquarium, and the aquarium was empty. And there he came for lunch. And they made everything to make him sit with the back to the aquarium. And I remember I was sure that he's going to burst out crying, and that when he will see that this tragedy happened to the fish. But then I realized that he came in, he saw that the fish were not there, he wouldn't give a damn. He knew in what world we were already living, and that the world was going on and what was happening. And the fish were, as you say, a capore. It was not important. For me, it was still important. For him, it wasn't important. So the fish went, and then many other things went after that.
Good. Let's stop for a moment.
Let's stop for a moment.
Wonderful. Wonderful. What is Okay. Before moving into the Warriors, if you don't mind, I'm going to back up a bit, and where I'd like to pick up on is the theft at your grandfather, the inventor's studio.
Oh yes. Okay. So you tell me.
Please.
I can start with a story. So as I was telling you, my mother's parents, this wonderful grandfather, inventor, poet in mechanics and so on, he was very spoiled by this very powerful wife of his, was paying she was paying his assistant, she was paying the keeping of his shop, she was paying mainly some very expensive tools and machinery that was always brought from Germany in order to make his inventions and make his machines more and more precise and perfect. And so it happened one day that my grandfather went to open his shop. He always walked with a huge dog. It was not a very common thing for a Vilna Jew to walk with a dog, but my grandfather did not. He looked like I would say a Russian retired general, because he was always shaving his head, and he was walking with this big dog. Well, he came there. The door was not locked. He came into his shop, and the machines were missing. The tools were missing, and this very special, unique machinery was missing. He was hardly able to breathe. He ran immediately to his mother, to tell her, this terrible thing happened to me, and so on. And he was at a loss. And she was a very practical woman, and she knew how the things in Vilna are organized, and she said, don't worry, we will deal with it, don't worry. And about a couple of days later, a man came to see my grandmother and told her, I have heard that there was a theft in your husband's workshop, and so on. I might be helpful, and maybe we could find out who did what, where the things are. She told him, my dear man, you know that I'm a very busy woman. Tell me how much I have to write out a check, and I want all the things back. So he came back a while later, and he told her how much that would cost. And a couple of days later, my grandfather went to his shop and found all the things there, and he ran to his wife, told her, Shifre, a miracle happened. You won't believe it. Extraordinary. All the things are there. I don't know how to explain it, and so on. He was in seventh heaven. He was so very excited that when he went, as he used to go every day to his barber to have his head shaved, he told a story. He told him, you don't know, something extraordinary happened to me, and so on. And there was among the clients who were sitting and waiting there was a man who came over to him and told him, you know, mister, your story interests me very much. I'm of the police, and I would like to investigate into it. So please come with me to the police station. Well, to make this story shorter, they found, they through the check and so on, they found the men who were the thieves. They found the man who was the in-between, and so on. And they arrested about 6 or 7 men who were sent to jail. I think that my grandmother also had most probably a very unpleasant situation there, because she has permitted herself to be blackmailed, but she somehow succeeded to get out of it. Now, the following thing happened. These 6 or 7 men who were in jail left wives and children and family who have lost their breadwinners. So they went to the rabbi of the Kehillah, and they called my grandmother to a din Torah. And din Torah, it means it's a religious judgment, and the rabbi pronounced the sentence that my grandmother was responsible for the needs of all the people who depended before on those who perpetrated the theft. So actually, until for a couple of years, until the Russians came and they nationalized everything, and my grandmother has lost everything. She was paying a regular salary to to all those families of the people who stole the goods of her husband. So this is a little story of the Vilna Mafia. I mean, Vilna is a fantastic city, and everybody knows that it had those extraordinary scholars and artists, and maybe communism was even invented in Vilna. And all these things were extraordinary. But you know, like normal people, when there are about 100,000 people living together, so you have the most beautiful things and also the most dreadful things, and nobody. Well, yes, maybe. You know, there is the thieves of Vilna had an international reputation. They were called the Vilna Ganovi.